Some secrets are buried so deep that even death can't keep them quiet. High in the wind-swept peaks of Colorado's San Juan Mountains, where winter holds dominion for 8 months of the year, Sarah McKenna pressed her hands against her swollen belly and stared at the yellowed letter trembling in her fingers. The cabin around her, her papa's refuge for 30 years, suddenly felt like a trap. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, sealing her off from the world below. The letter's words burned in her mind. "If you're reading this, I'm dead, and they've found me." Her father's familiar handwriting continued with revelations that shattered everything she thought she knew. He wasn't Thomas McKenna, the quiet mountain man who delivered babies and healed the sick. He was David Castellano, a federal witness who'd helped convict the most dangerous crime family in Chicago. Sarah's labor pains had started an hour ago, coming in waves that matched her rising terror. No phone service, no way down the mountain. And according to this letter, killers who'd been patient for decades were finally closing in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The contraction seized her like a vice, doubling her over until she gripped the rough-hewn mantelpiece for support. Sarah breathed through it the way she'd taught dozens of expectant mothers over the years, counting seconds until the pain ebbed. 8 minutes since the last one. The baby wasn't waiting for rescue. She forced herself to refold the letter with steady hands, though her mind reeled with its impossible revelations. David Castellano. Her papa had been David Castellano, who'd testified against the Torino crime family in 1987. The man who taught her to deliver breech babies and set broken bones in their remote mountain community had once sat in a federal courtroom, putting murderers behind bars. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's familiar interior. Everything looked the same. Papa's medical texts lining the shelves, his worn leather chair positioned to catch the morning light, the collection of hand-carved walking sticks by the door. But the letter had transformed it all into props in someone else's life, a carefully constructed fiction she'd inhabited for 29 years. Sarah lowered herself into Papa's chair, her movements awkward with the weight of her pregnancy. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. She'd been planning to give birth here anyway, in the cabin where she'd been born, with Papa as her midwife, just as he'd been for half the children in Copper Falls. But Papa was gone now, killed in what everyone called a tragic snowmobile accident 3 weeks ago. Except according to his letter, it hadn't been an accident at all. They've been watching, waiting. His handwriting had warned, patient as spiders. They know about you, about your child. The Torinos never forget, and they never forgive. Another contraction built, stronger this time, radiating from her lower back around to her abdomen. Sarah closed her eyes and rode the wave, her mind automatically cataloguing the signs. First stage of labor, early phase. She had hours yet before the baby came, maybe 8 or 10 if this was following a typical pattern. Time enough to think, to plan. But plan what? The nearest neighbor was 4 miles down a treacherous mountain road that became impassable in winter weather like this. Her jeep sat buried under 2 feet of snow in the clearing outside, and even if she could dig it out, the access road would be suicide in a blizzard. The landline had been dead for a week, storm damage she'd assumed. Her cell phone showed the familiar no-service message that was a constant companion at this elevation. She was exactly where Papa had taught her to be self-sufficient, where she'd learned to handle any medical emergency with her own skills and whatever supplies were at hand. The irony wasn't lost on her that his greatest gift, her independence, might now be what got her killed. The letter rustled as she unfolded it again, searching for clues she might have missed. Papa's handwriting grew shakier toward the end, as if he'd written it in haste or under extreme stress. I thought 30 years was long enough, thought they'd given up, moved on to other business. But Jimmy Torino got out last month. He was only 19 when I testified, but he had his grandfather's eyes, cold as winter stone. If something happens to me, if it looks like an accident, you'll know the truth. There's money hidden behind the loose stone in the cellar wall, enough to disappear if you're careful. New identities cost more now, but Vincent Chen in Denver can still be trusted. Tell him I sent you. Tell him it's time to collect on Tucson. Don't trust anyone else. Not the sheriff, not Doc Williams, not even Mary Hutchins. I don't know how deep this goes, but they've had 30 years to plant roots. Sarah's hands moved protectively over her belly. Mary Hutchins had been at Papa's funeral, weeping as hard as Sarah herself. She'd brought casseroles for a week afterward, checking on Sarah's pregnancy, offering to help with anything she needed. The woman had delivered 3 babies with Papa's assistance, had trusted him with her family's lives. But then again, everyone in Copper Falls had trusted Thomas McKenna. None of them knew they'd been confiding in a ghost. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Sarah glanced toward the storm. Snow swirled past the glass in hypnotic patterns, nature's own curtain falling across the mountains. Beautiful and deadly, like everything else about this place that had shaped her. She struggled to her feet and walked to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding her through the motions of making tea. The kettle's weight felt reassuring in her hands, a tangible anchor to the present moment. Whatever came next, she was still Sarah McKenna, still a midwife who delivered 43 babies without losing a single mother or child. The contraction hit while she stood at the stove, stronger than before, 7 minutes this time. She was going to have this baby tonight, alone in a snowbound cabin, while killers who'd waited 3 decades might finally be closing in. Time to see what Thomas McKenna had taught his daughter about survival. The kettle's whistle pierced the cabin's silence, jolting Sarah back to the present. Steam clouded the kitchen window as she poured hot water over chamomile tea, Papa's remedy for anxiety, though she doubted even his gentle wisdom could calm the storm raging in her chest now. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred honey into the cup, muscle memory from thousands of quiet evenings in this same kitchen when life had been beautifully, blissfully ordinary. This time yesterday, her biggest worry had been whether to name the baby Thomas or Elena. She'd been planning the birth with meticulous care, clean sheets already laid out in the bedroom, her medical bag organized with everything she'd need for delivery, even backup plans if complications arose. Papa had taught her to prepare for every contingency except this one, discovering your entire life was built on a lie, while labor pains announced your child's imminent arrival. The tea warmed her throat, but couldn't touch the cold fear spreading through her chest. She thought about her morning routine from just this past week, checking on pregnant mothers in town, stopping by the general store where Mrs. Patterson always asked about her due date, picking up supplies at the pharmacy where Dr. Williams would inquire about her blood pressure. Simple interactions that had felt like embraces from a community that had watched her grow up, that trusted her with their most precious moments. Now every memory felt contaminated. Had Mrs. Patterson's questions been genuine concern or careful surveillance? When Dr. Williams checked her blood pressure, was he monitoring her health or gathering information for someone else? The thought made her stomach churn with something beyond pregnancy nausea. Another contraction seized her, and she gripped the kitchen counter, breathing through the wave of pressure. 6 minutes now. The baby was definitely coming tonight, whether she was ready or not. At least labor was familiar territory. She'd assisted Papa with dozens of deliveries, had studied every complication and intervention until the process became second nature. Birth was the one crisis she actually knew how to handle. She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency despite her awkward gait, gathering supplies and arranging them within easy reach of the bedroom. Clean towels, sterilized scissors, suture materials, the precious vials of Pitocin and antibiotics Papa had somehow managed to keep stocked in their remote location. His medical training had been thorough, wherever he'd learned it, whoever he'd been before becoming Thomas McKenna. The letter lay on the kitchen table where she'd left it, Papa's desperate handwriting visible even from across the room. She should probably burn it, eliminate the evidence that had already shattered her world. But something kept her from feeding those pages to the fire. Maybe it was the only real piece of her father she had left, his genuine terror for her safety, his love breaking through 3 decades of carefully maintained fiction. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, and snow continued falling in thick curtains beyond the windows. This storm would last through tomorrow at least, maybe longer. In the old days, that prospect had filled her with cozy anticipation, time to read Papa's medical journals, practice her suturing techniques on spare fabric, prepare herbal remedies for the community's winter ailments. The isolation had never felt threatening when Papa was alive. If anything, it had felt protective, insulating them from a world that moved too fast and cared too little. Now that same isolation felt like a trap. She thought about the baby growing heavy in her womb, already loved beyond measure despite being unborn. What kind of world was she bringing this child into? Would they spend their lives running from shadows, always looking over their shoulders, never able to trust the kindness of strangers? Or would they end up like Papa, forced to build new identities and leave everything behind? The baby deserved better. It deserved the life Sarah had planned, growing up surrounded by mountains and community, learning to deliver babies and heal the sick, carrying on the McKenna legacy of service. It deserved the childhood Sarah remembered, full of hiking trails and summer picnics and Papa's gentle lessons about helping others. But that life might have been stolen the moment Jimmy Torino walked out of prison. Another contraction hit, stronger and longer than before. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, on the simple biological miracle happening inside her body. Whatever chaos surrounded them, her baby was still fighting to be born. That had to count for something. Life insisting on itself despite danger, hope persisting even when the world felt ready to collapse. 5 minutes between contractions now. Soon she'd need to focus entirely on the birth, trusting her training and Papa's teachings to guide her through. But first, she had a decision to make, about the money hidden behind the cellar wall, about Vincent Chen in Denver, about whether Thomas McKenna's daughter would run or fight. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if offering an opinion on their limited options. Time was running out in more ways than one. Sarah set down her teacup and waddled toward the cellar door, each step a negotiation between her unwieldy body and her desperate need for answers. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the cool darkness below, one hand gripping the rail while the other supported her belly. Papa's workshop stretched before her, shelves lined with mason jars full of dried herbs, his old medical equipment carefully maintained despite decades of use, and tools whose purposes she'd never questioned. The cellar wall looked solid, but Papa's letter had been specific, behind the loose stone in the cellar wall. She ran her hands along the rough fieldstone foundation, pressing each block until one shifted slightly under pressure. Her heart hammered as she worked the stone free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside sat a waterproof bag, heavier than she'd expected. Sarah pulled it out with trembling fingers and carried it upstairs, pausing halfway as another contraction gripped her. 4.5 minutes now. The baby wasn't waiting for her to process this nightmare. She dumped the bag's contents onto the kitchen table, and her breath caught. Bundles of cash, more money than she'd ever seen in one place. A manila envelope thick with documents, and something that made her stomach drop, a loaded pistol wrapped in oiled cloth. Papa had been Thomas McKenna, gentle country doctor who delivered babies and set broken bones with hands that never showed violence. But David Castellano had owned a gun and hidden it like he expected to need it. Sarah picked up the manila envelope with shaking hands. Inside were birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, all bearing different names but her photograph and Papa's. The craftsmanship was flawless, professional quality that spoke of serious connections and serious money. Elizabeth Harper from Sacramento, Jennifer Walsh from Phoenix, Rebecca Stone from Portland, 3 complete identities waiting to be claimed. A piece of paper fluttered to the floor, Vincent Chen's contact information written in Papa's careful script, along with coded phrases she didn't understand. Tell him the mountain remembers Tucson, payment for old debts. The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows with new fury. But underneath its howl, Sarah heard something that turned her blood to ice water, the distant rumble of an engine. She moved to the front window and peered through the swirling snow. Headlights cut through the darkness, twin beams advancing slowly up the mountain road that should have been impassable. The engine sound grew louder, not the high whine of a snowmobile, but the deep growl of a heavy vehicle equipped for winter conditions. Sarah's training kicked in even as panic flooded her system. She swept the money and documents back into the bag, her movements swift despite the baby's weight. Another contraction hit, and she breathed through it while stuffing Papa's pistol into her coat pocket. The metal felt alien against her palm, a weight that belonged to someone else's life. The engine sound stopped. In the sudden silence, broken only by wind and her own ragged breathing, Sarah heard doors slamming. Multiple doors. More than one person had come calling at midnight in a blizzard, and she doubted they were concerned, neighbors checking on the pregnant woman. Footsteps crunched through snow, circling the cabin. Professional movement, coordinated. Sarah's mind raced through Papa's lessons about emergency childbirth, but he'd never covered what to do when killers arrived during active labor. She killed the lights and moved away from the windows, grabbing her medical bag and the waterproof pouch. The back door led to a small mudroom and then outside, but in this storm, that route meant certain death from exposure. The cellar offered hiding places but no escape routes. A knock echoed through the cabin, polite, almost gentle. "Miss McKenna? We're with the sheriff's department. We received reports of a medical emergency." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She knew every deputy in the county, and this voice belonged to none of them. Papa's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust the sheriff, not Doc Williams, not even Mary Hutchins. "Miss McKenna, we know you're in there. We're here to help." Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. She bit down hard on her knuckle to keep from crying out, tasting blood as the pain peaked. 4 minutes apart now. The baby was coming whether she wanted it to or not. The knocking stopped. In the terrible quiet that followed, Sarah heard the soft scrape of metal against metal, lock picks working at her front door. She had seconds to choose, hide and pray they'd leave, try to run into a storm that would kill her and her baby within hours, or fight with a gun she'd never fired while contractions tore through her body. The lock clicked open. Papa's voice whispered in her memory from 1,000 medical emergencies. "When everything goes wrong, trust your training and do what needs doing." Sarah checked the pistol's safety and positioned herself behind Papa's heavy oak desk, the waterproof bag clutched against her chest. Her baby kicked urgently, as if sensing the danger closing around them both. The door swung open, and 3 figures stepped into her ordinary world, transforming it forever. The 3 men moved through her doorway like wolves entering a fold, deliberate, predatory, their eyes scanning the darkened cabin with practiced efficiency. Sarah pressed herself deeper behind Papa's desk, the gun heavy and unfamiliar in her grip. Every instinct screamed at her to shoot first, to protect her baby at any cost, but Papa's voice echoed in her memory. "Think before you act, Sarah. Panic kills more patients than disease." But these weren't patients, and this wasn't a medical emergency she could diagnose and treat. The tallest man wore a sheriff's department jacket that looked authentic in the dim light. He had kind eyes and graying temples, the sort of face that belonged on campaign posters promising community safety. "Miss McKenna," he called softly, "we know you're frightened. Your neighbor called about screaming, said it sounded like someone in distress." Sarah bit back a bitter laugh. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, and Mrs. Henderson was deaf as a post. These men had crafted a reasonable lie, but they'd made it for someone who didn't know these mountains like she did. Another contraction built, and Sarah fought to keep her breathing silent as pain radiated through her body. The baby was pressing lower now, her body preparing for delivery, whether she wanted it to happen or not. She couldn't run, couldn't hide much longer, but something held her back from pulling the trigger. Maybe it was the years of training to preserve life rather than take it. Maybe it was the terrifying possibility that she was wrong, that these really were deputies responding to a call. But Papa's letter burned in her memory. They've had 30 years to plant roots. The second man was younger, with the lean build of someone who stayed in fighting shape. He moved toward the kitchen with silent steps, and Sarah watched him register the abandoned teacup, the disrupted items on the counter. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, and something about that gesture, too comfortable, too ready, convinced her these weren't ordinary law enforcement officers. "Miss McKenna," the older man continued, his voice growing more concerned, "we know you're in labor. Let us help you get to the hospital. This storm's dangerous, but we have a vehicle that can make it down the mountain." The third man said nothing, just stood by the door like a sentry, but Sarah caught the way his eyes moved, cataloguing exits and angles. Papa had taught her to read people during medical crises, how fear showed in the set of someone's shoulders, how pain revealed itself in breathing patterns. This man showed neither fear nor concern. He showed the cold patience of someone waiting for prey to exhaust itself. Her medical bag sat within arm's reach, and Sarah found herself thinking about the Pitocin inside it. How ironic that the drug meant to help deliver her baby safely could also cause hemorrhaging if administered wrong. She'd studied every way birth could go catastrophically wrong, but she'd never imagined facing that knowledge while armed men prowled her childhood home. Another contraction gripped her, and this time she couldn't completely suppress a small gasp. The men froze, heads turning toward her hiding place like hunting dogs catching a scent. "There you are," the older man said gently. "Miss McKenna, I'm Deputy Harrison. This is Deputy Collins and Deputy Martinez. We're here to help." Sarah's mind raced. She knew every law enforcement officer within 50 miles, had treated their children's fevers and delivered their grandchildren. There was no Deputy Harrison in the county, no Collins or Martinez, but they wore the uniforms, carried the weapons, spoke with the authority of men accustomed to being believed and obeyed. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Sarah felt something shift inside her, a settling, a preparation. The child would be born soon, within hours if not less. She thought about Papa's hands, so gentle when he'd taught her to suture wounds, so steady when he'd guided her through her first solo delivery. Those same hands had once held evidence that sent killers to prison, had signed testimony that marked him for death. Now her hands, trained in healing, dedicated to bringing life into the world, gripped a weapon meant for killing. "Miss McKenna," Deputy Harrison said, taking a step closer to the desk, "I know this is scary. Labor can make everything seem overwhelming, but you and your baby need medical attention. Let us help you." The kindness in his voice almost convinced her. It would be so easy to believe, to stand up and surrender to their care, to let someone else make the impossible decisions while her body focused on the overwhelming task of birth. But Papa's letter had been written in desperate fear, hidden with the kind of care that spoke of genuine terror, and somewhere in a prison cell, Jimmy Torino had counted down 30 years until he could claim his grandfather's revenge. The contraction peaked, and Sarah closed her eyes, riding the wave while her finger rested on the trigger of Papa's gun. When she opened them again, all three men were staring directly at her hiding place. "Hello, Sarah," Deputy Harrison said, his kind mask finally slipping. "We've been waiting a long time to meet you." The moment of pretense shattered like ice under pressure. Sarah's world narrowed to the three men standing in her father's cabin, their false badges glinting in the firelight, and the gun trembling in her hands. Every gentle lesson Papa had taught her about healing and helping others crashed against the brutal reality that some people came to destroy rather than save. 37 years, Harrison continued, his voice losing all pretense of warmth. "That's how long we've been patient. Your father thought he was so clever, disappearing into these mountains, playing country doctor." He stepped closer, and Sarah saw the cold satisfaction in his eyes. "But blood calls to blood, doesn't it? And Jimmy Torino never forgets." Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and Sarah gripped the desk edge to keep from crying out. 3 minutes apart now. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether the world was safe or consumed by her father's sins. Biology didn't pause for human catastrophe. "You're going to stand up slowly," the younger man, Collins, said, drawing his weapon. "Keep your hands where we can see them. We know you're armed, Sarah. Daddy's little pistol won't do you much good, but we'd prefer this stays clean." Clean. As if murder could ever be clean. As if killing a woman in labor was just another task to be completed efficiently. Sarah's mind raced through impossible calculations. Papa's medical journals had contained detailed descriptions of what the body could endure during childbirth, how adrenaline could mask pain and sharpen focus even as the cervix dilated and contractions intensified. Women had given birth in trenches during wars, in bombed-out buildings, in circumstances that should have been impossible. The human body was remarkably resilient when survival demanded it. But Papa had never written about delivering a baby while fighting for your life. "We know about Vincent Chen," Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been charming under different circumstances. "About the money, the documents. Your father was thorough, we'll give him that. But he made one mistake." "What mistake?" Sarah found her voice, surprised by how steady it sounded despite the terror coursing through her veins. Harrison smiled, and it was worse than his anger had been. "He loved you too much to disappear completely. Kept tabs on your life, your career. Even sent a Christmas card to the midwifery program when you graduated. Very touching." The words hit her like a physical blow. Papa's pride in her accomplishments, the way he'd beam when she successfully delivered a difficult baby or diagnosed a complication. It had felt like pure love, and it had been, but it had also been their downfall. He'd been too human to vanish completely, too much of a father to let his daughter believe she was truly alone in the world. "We've been watching for years," Collins added, "waiting for the right moment. A blizzard, isolation, and you helpless in labor. Poetry, really." Another contraction gripped her, and this time Sarah couldn't hide the gasp of pain. The baby was definitely coming. She could feel the pressure building, her body preparing for the final stage whether her mind was ready or not. In a few hours she might be holding her child. Or they might both be dead in the snow, another footnote in Jimmy Torino's quest for revenge. Something crystallized in that moment of agony. Sarah thought about the letter sewn into Papa's coat, written in his shaking hand as he prepared for this exact scenario. He'd known they would come eventually. He'd known she might face this choice, surrender and die, or fight, and maybe live. Papa had chosen to fight 37 years ago when he'd testified against the Torino family. He'd sacrificed everything, his identity, his freedom, his ability to live openly, to put killers behind bars. Now it was Sarah's turn to choose. She thought about the baby moving inside her, already loved beyond measure, already deserving a chance at life, about all the mothers she'd helped deliver healthy children, the way their faces lit up when they heard that first cry, about Papa's hands guiding hers through complicated births, his voice steady and sure when everything goes wrong. Trust your training and do what needs doing. Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. "You're right about one thing," she said, shifting her weight behind the desk. "Papa did make a mistake." She paused as another contraction built, using the pain to focus her resolve. "He should have taught me to shoot." In the same motion, she rolled sideways away from the desk and pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the night, and Sarah's old life, the safe, predictable existence of a mountain midwife, died with the sound. There was no going back now, no return to innocence. She'd crossed into territory Papa had tried to protect her from, where survival meant violence and love meant running. The threshold had been crossed. The real fight was just beginning. The shot echoed through the cabin like thunder, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, Sarah wasn't sure if she'd hit anything or simply announced her position to trained killers. Her ears rang from the gunshot, and gunpowder smoke burned her nostrils as she scrambled behind Papa's heavy bookshelf, the waterproof bag clutched against her swollen belly. Collins was down, clutching his shoulder and cursing in words that would have made Papa wash his mouth with soap. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against his fake deputy's uniform. Sarah felt a sick mixture of relief and horror. She'd wounded rather than killed, which meant he was still dangerous but no longer the immediate threat. "You little bitch." Harrison's mask of kindness had completely shattered. "Martinez, circle around, she's trapped." But Sarah wasn't thinking like a trapped animal anymore. Papa's voice echoed in her memory from a dozen emergency situations. Assessment first, action second. What resources do you have? What does the patient need? Except now she was both doctor and patient, protector and protected. Another contraction seized her, and Sarah bit down on her knuckle to stay silent. 2.5 minutes apart. The baby wasn't waiting for this nightmare to end. But in that moment of pain, something shifted in her understanding. These men expected her to cower, to behave like a helpless woman in labor. They'd planned for fear, not fight. She heard Martinez moving through the kitchen, his boots careful on the wooden floor. Harrison was advancing from the front, speaking in low, soothing tones like she was a spooked animal. "Sarah, let's end this. You can't run in your condition. Come out and we'll make it quick. Quick." As if mercy meant anything to men who'd hunted her family for decades. But Papa had prepared for this in ways she was only beginning to understand. The bookshelf she crouched behind wasn't just furniture. It was positioned strategically, creating sightlines to both the kitchen and front room while providing solid cover. Papa had arranged this cabin like a fortress, and she'd been too innocent to recognize the signs. Sarah checked the pistol's chamber. 4 rounds left. She'd practiced basic gun safety with Papa years ago, but marksmanship hadn't been part of her medical education. Still, at close range in a confined space, accuracy mattered less than determination. A board creaked behind her. Martinez had circled through the mudroom, approaching from her blind spot. Sarah pivoted just as his shadow fell across the floor, raising the gun with both hands the way Papa had taught her during those long-ago lessons. "Drop it, puta," Martinez said, his weapon trained on her center mass. "Your baby dies with you." The words hit like ice water, but something in his tone, a hint of uncertainty, maybe even reluctance, gave Sarah pause. She'd spent years reading people in medical crises, recognizing when someone was following orders versus acting from conviction. "You don't want to do this," she said, keeping the gun steady despite another contraction building in her core. "I'm a midwife. I help bring babies into the world. What does that make you?" For a split second, something flickered in Martinez's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or just the human recognition that killing a woman in labor violated codes deeper than loyalty to dead crime bosses. That hesitation cost him everything. The front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and snow. A figure rolled through the opening, lean, fast, wearing winter gear that looked military surplus. Harrison spun toward the new threat, and Sarah heard the distinctive crack of a rifle shot from outside the cabin. Harrison dropped like a puppet with cut strings. "Stay down," the newcomer shouted, advancing on Martinez with movements that screamed Special Forces training. "Federal agent, drop your weapon." Sarah recognized the voice even before she saw the face. Vincent Chen, Papa's contact, the man whose information had been hidden with the money and false identities. He moved like lethal water through the cabin's chaos, his rifle tracking between Martinez and the wounded Collins with professional precision. But Martinez wasn't surrendering. He swung his gun toward Sarah, desperation replacing discipline in his movements. "She dies or we all—" 2 shots rang out simultaneously, Sarah's from instinct and terror, Chen's from training and purpose. Martinez crumpled, his weapon skittering across Papa's handmade wooden floor. The silence that followed felt dense as cotton, broken only by wind through the shattered window, and Sarah's ragged breathing. Chen kicked the weapons away from the fallen men, his movements efficient and practiced. "Sarah McKenna?" He turned to her, and she saw Asian features marked by old scars and older wisdom. "Your father sent word if anything happened to him, I should watch for trouble. Took me 6 hours to get up here through the storm." Another contraction seized her, the strongest yet, and Sarah doubled over with a cry she couldn't suppress. When it passed, she looked up to find Chen studying her with concern that seemed genuine. "How far apart?" he asked. 2 minutes, she gasped. Maybe less. Chen swore softly in what sounded like Mandarin. We need to move. There'll be more coming and you need medical attention. Sarah looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary, now violated by blood and gunpowder and the knowledge that safety had always been an illusion. Papa's real war had finally found her, but maybe, just maybe, she'd found an ally worth trusting. Sarah's hands shook as she lowered Papa's gun, the weight of what she'd done settling over her like the mountain cold seeping through the shattered window. She'd killed a man. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, warring with relief and the primal need to protect her unborn child. Blood pooled beneath Martinez's still form, dark against the pine planks Papa had laid with his own hands decades ago. We have maybe 20 minutes, Chen said, methodically checking each fallen man for signs of life. His voice carried the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to violence, but Sarah caught the urgency beneath. These weren't the only ones. Torino's organization has had 30 years to rebuild, and they've been patient. Another contraction gripped her, and Sarah braced against the bookshelf, fighting to stay focused through the mounting pressure in her pelvis. The baby was coming, whether the world was safe or burning down around them. Biology didn't negotiate with human crisis. I can't travel, she gasped when the pain receded. Not like this. The baby will die if we stay here. Chen shouldered his rifle and moved to the window, scanning the tree line beyond the cabin. Snow swirled in the wind, and Sarah could barely make out the shapes of the vehicles the fake deputies had arrived in. Your father prepared for this scenario. There's a safe house 40 miles north, medical supplies, everything you need for delivery. 40 miles? Sarah stared at him in disbelief. In active labor? Through a blizzard? Better than dying here when reinforcements arrive. Chen's tone was matter-of-fact but not unkind. Your father knew this day would come. He planned for it. Sarah thought about Papa's letter, written in his shaking hand, as he faced the reality that his past would eventually claim his future. If anything happens to me, you must flee immediately. But even Papa couldn't have imagined this. His daughter in labor, trapped between giving birth and running for her life. Who are you really? She asked, studying Chen's scarred face. Papa mentioned Vincent Chen in his letter, but you're not just some contact, are you? Chen paused in his surveillance, something shifting in his expression. 25 years DEA. I helped build the case against the Torino family back in '87. Your father saved my life during the investigation, took a bullet meant for me during a safe house raid. He touched a scar along his jawline. I've been watching over his interests ever since. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Sarah wasn't sure she trusted. Papa had never mentioned taking a bullet for anyone, but then again, Papa had never mentioned being in witness protection either. How many secrets had he carried to protect her innocence? Another contraction seized her, stronger and longer than before. Sarah felt something shift deep inside, a settling that made her breath catch. She'd delivered enough babies to recognize the signs. This child was coming soon, ready or not. Chen, she managed when the pain subsided. I'm not going to make it 40 miles. The baby's dropped. I can feel the pressure changing. For the first time since crashing through her window, Chen looked genuinely worried. How long? An hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Sarah struggled to stand, one hand pressed to the small of her back where the pain had settled like a burning coal. But that's if everything goes perfectly. And first babies don't follow schedules. Chen swore again, this time in English. The safe house has a doctor standing by, equipment for complications. I am the doctor, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I've delivered over 300 babies. What I need isn't 40 miles away through a blizzard. It's right here. She gestured toward her medical bag, still clutched against her side like a lifeline. Inside were the basic tools of her trade: sterile gloves, clamps, sutures, medications for hemorrhage control. Not ideal for a birth under siege, but she'd worked with less in emergency situations. Sarah, listen to me. Chen moved closer, his voice gentle but urgent. These men were just the advance team. Torino's grandson, is personally overseeing this operation. He'll have backup, communications, resources we can't match. Staying here is suicide. Then we make our stand. The words surprised Sarah even as she spoke them. When had she become someone who talked about making stands? A week ago, her biggest concern had been whether to use cloth or disposable diapers. Now she was contemplating giving birth while under siege by organized crime. But Pa's voice echoed in her memory from a dozen medical emergencies. Sometimes the most dangerous choice is the safest one. Trust your training. Her training said the baby was coming now, whether they ran or stayed. Her training said traveling in active labor through mountain terrain in a blizzard was nearly as dangerous as facing whatever reinforcements might arrive. And her training said that panic killed more patients than complications ever did. Sarah looked around the cabin. Papa's fortress, she realized now, designed for exactly this scenario. Solid walls, strategic sightlines, winter supplies, and her complete medical kit. Maybe running wasn't always the answer. Maybe sometimes you had to trust that love and preparation were enough. Chen stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing decades of tactical training against the reality of a woman in advanced labor. Finally, he nodded with grim acceptance. "Then we fortify," he said, moving toward the kitchen. "But we do this right." Sarah watched him work with professional efficiency, dragging furniture to block the broken window, checking sight lines, gathering weapons from the fallen men. The federal agent had become a different creature entirely, not the concerned ally who'd crashed through her window, but something harder and more dangerous. Another contraction hit, and this time Sarah felt the unmistakable pressure of the baby descending. She gripped the edge of Papa's dining table, breathing through the pain while her mind catalogued what she needed. Clean sheets, boiling water, adequate lighting. The basics of birth in a world suddenly stripped of civilization. "Chen," she gasped as the contraction peaked, "I need you to understand something. When this baby decides to come, everything else stops. I won't be able to help defend us. I won't even be able to hold a gun." He paused in his fortification efforts, the weight of her words settling over him. "How long will you be vulnerable? From active transition until delivery? Maybe an hour of complete helplessness." Sarah struggled toward her medical bag, each step sending jolts of pressure through her pelvis. Then recovery time if there are complications. Bleeding, tears, shock, any number of things that could make me useless for hours. Jesus. Chen ran a hand through his graying hair. "Your father never prepared me for this scenario. Papa never imagined his daughter would be giving birth during a siege." Sarah pulled sterile gloves from her bag, along with clamps and sutures that suddenly looked pathetically inadequate. "But this is what we have. This is what we work with." Through the reinforced window, she caught movement in the tree line. A flash of color that wasn't snow or pine. Chen saw it too, his rifle swinging toward the threat with practiced precision. "Contact," he murmured. "At least 2 vehicles, maybe more. They're positioning for an assault." Sarah felt hysteria bubbling in her throat like acid. How had her life become this? A week ago, her biggest crisis had been a breech delivery at the county hospital. Now she was preparing to give birth while an organized crime family prepared to kill her. But Papa's voice cut through the panic. "Steady as mountain stone, when everything falls apart, you fall back on training. Trust what you know." She knew birth. She knew the fierce determination of women bringing life into the world against impossible odds. She'd seen teenage mothers deliver healthy babies in hospital hallways, farm wives give birth in pickup trucks racing toward medical help, women who found strength they never knew they possessed when their children needed them. This was just another delivery. Extreme circumstances, yes, but the process remained the same. Her body knew what to do. The baby knew when to come. Everything else was just complications. "Chen," she said, her voice steadying as another contraction built. "I need you to promise me something. Name it. If they get through your defenses, if this goes bad, save the baby." Sarah met his eyes, seeing her own desperation reflected there. Whatever happens to me, that child gets out alive. Chen's scarred face went very still. Sarah, promise me. The contraction peaked, and Sarah doubled over with a cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. When it passed, she found Chen watching her with something that looked like wonder mixed with terror. "How do you do this?" he asked quietly. "Face something this dangerous and still think about protecting someone else?" "Because that's what mothers do," Sarah whispered, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones like gravity. "We become dangerous when our children are threatened." Outside, she heard the distant slam of car doors, the crunch of boots in snow, voices calling orders in the wind. The Torino family's reinforcements had arrived, and Sarah's window of escape had closed forever. Chen moved to his position by the fortified window, weapon ready. "Sarah, I need you to get to the bedroom. Farthest from the action, most protection if bullets start flying." Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, and Sarah felt her body begin the final preparations for birth. The baby was coming now, ready or not, safe or surrounded by killers. Biology didn't pause for human violence. "It's starting," she gasped, clutching her medical bag. "Chen, whatever happens out there, the real fight is about to begin in here." As if summoned by her words, a voice called through the wind from the darkness beyond the cabin. Young, confident, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sarah McKenna, my name is Anthony Torino. We need to talk." Papa's past had finally arrived at her door, and Sarah's greatest fear was about to be tested. Whether love could triumph over vengeance, whether new life could survive old hatred. The ordeal had truly begun. The dark moment. Sarah froze halfway to the bedroom, her medical bag clutched against her swollen belly as Anthony Torino's voice cut through the howling wind. The name carried the weight of 3 decades, Papa's nightmares made flesh, standing in the snow outside her sanctuary. "We know you're in there, Sarah," Torino continued, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "We know about Agent Chen, too. Former DEA, been off the books for 2 years now. No backup coming, no cavalry riding over the hill." Chen's jaw tightened, but he kept his rifle trained on the darkness beyond the fortified window. "He's fishing," he murmured to Sarah, "trying to break our resolve." Another contraction seized her, and Sarah bit back a scream. The pain was different now, deeper, more urgent, accompanied by pressure that made her legs shake. Her water broke with a sudden gush that soaked through her jeans, the warm fluid a stark reminder that biology didn't negotiate with human violence. "Chen," she gasped, clutching the doorframe. "My water just broke. The baby's coming now." Through the broken window, Torino's voice carried a note of cruel amusement. "Are we interrupting something important, Sarah? Because we can wait. Family business should be handled properly." The mockery in his words ignited something primal in Sarah's chest. This man, this boy, really, probably younger than she was, spoke of family while hunting hers to extinction. He'd never felt a child move beneath his heart, never experienced the fierce protectiveness that transformed ordinary women into warriors. "What do you want?" Chen called out, buying time while Sarah struggled toward the bedroom. "Justice," came the reply. "Your boyfriend's father cost my family everything. Money, respect, blood. 3 of my uncles died because of his testimony. My grandfather spent his last 20 years looking over his shoulder, never feeling safe." Sarah reached Papa's bedroom and sank onto the quilted bed her grandmother had sewn by hand. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to give birth in the same room where she'd been born, the circle of life completing itself while death waited outside. "And now," Torino continued, his voice closer now, "we finish what should have been done in 1987. Clean the slate, end the bloodline." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. End the bloodline. Her baby, innocent and hours away from first breath, was already condemned by sins committed before Sarah had learned to walk. "Chen," she whispered urgently, "I need to push. The baby's crowning." Chen's face went pale. Already? Fast labor runs in my family. Sarah struggled out of her soaked jeans, her hands shaking as she pulled sterile gloves from her medical bag. Papa used to joke that McKenna women didn't have time for long deliveries. Papa, who'd spent 30 years believing his secrets would protect her, never imagining they'd ultimately destroy everything he'd tried to save. Another voice joined Torino's outside, older, rougher, speaking in rapid Italian. Sarah caught fragments, positioning, coverage, no witnesses. The clinical discussion of her execution while she prepared to bring life into the world. "Sarah McKenna," Torino called again. "I'm going to count to 10. Then we come in shooting. But if you walk out now, we'll make it quick. Professional. Your baby won't suffer." The lie burned in Sarah's throat. Men who'd hunted her family for 3 decades weren't offering mercy. They were savoring the moment, drawing out the fear like fine wine. A massive contraction seized her, and this time Sarah couldn't hold back the scream. The sound echoed through the cabin, primal and raw, announcing to everyone within a mile that new life was fighting to enter the world. 1. Torino began counting. Sarah felt the baby's head emerge, slippery and perfect and utterly vulnerable. She guided the delivery by instinct and training, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around her. 2. Chen appeared in the doorway, his face torn between professional duty and human concern. "Sarah, they're moving. Multiple positions. 3. The baby's shoulders rotated, and Sarah felt the familiar miracle of a child preparing for first breath, but instead of joy, terror flooded her system. This baby would enter a world where killers waited with guns drawn, where innocence was just another casualty of ancient vengeance. 4. Sarah eased the baby free, and her daughter, it was a girl, Papa would have been so proud, entered the world in perfect silence. No cry, no movement, just terrible stillness that made Sarah's heart stop. 5. The baby wasn't breathing. Sarah's medical training kicked in, but her hands shook as she cleared the infant's airway, tilted the tiny head, began the delicate process of coaxing life into unresponsive lungs. 6. Still nothing. The baby lay limp in her arms, blue-tinged and silent, while her executioners counted down outside. Everything Papa had died to protect, his daughter, his granddaughter, his hope for redemption, was slipping away in a cabin filled with blood and broken glass. All seemed lost. 7. Sarah's world collapsed to the size of her daughter's silent face. Blue lips, closed eyes, no movement in the tiny chest. Every instinct screamed at her to panic, but Papa's voice cut through the terror. "Trust your training." She tilted the baby's head back, opened the miniature airway, and delivered 2 gentle breaths into lungs that had never tasted air. Nothing. The counting continued outside, but Sarah heard only her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. 8. "Come on, baby girl," Sarah whispered, beginning chest compressions with 2 fingers against a ribcage no bigger than a bird's. "Fight for it. Fight like your mama. Fight like your granddaddy." 9. And then, a weak cough, a flutter of eyelids. The baby's chest rose with a shuddering breath, followed by the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard, her daughter's first cry, thin but strong, announcing her arrival to a world that wanted her dead. 10. The front door exploded inward just as Sarah pressed the baby against her chest, feeling that tiny heart beating fierce and fast. Chen's rifle cracked once, twice, and someone outside screamed, but Sarah barely registered the violence erupting beyond the bedroom door. Because in that moment, holding her crying daughter while bullets shattered the cabin's windows, Sarah McKenna finally understood what her father had truly given her. Not just his protective love, not just his desperate warnings, his strength. The revelation hit her like lightning. Papa hadn't spent 30 years running from his past. He'd spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment. Every hunting lesson, every survival skill, every story about never giving up when the odds looked impossible. He'd been training her to be dangerous when she needed to be. We become dangerous when our children are threatened. The words she'd spoken to Chen crystallized into understanding. Papa had known the Torinos would eventually come, known Sarah might have to face them alone, known she'd need to be more than just a midwife when her family was threatened. "Sarah!" Chen's voice carried desperation as gunfire erupted in the main room. "They're inside!" Sarah looked down at her daughter, Papa's granddaughter, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. The helpless, terrified woman disappeared, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. A mother defending her child. She wrapped the baby in Papa's old hunting shirt, the one that had hidden his letter all these years, and moved toward her medical bag with newfound purpose. Her hands found the emergency medication she'd packed for hemorrhage control, powerful sedatives that could stop a woman's bleeding or put a grown man to sleep in seconds. Papa had taught her to hunt, to track, to read the mountain's moods, but he'd also taught her that sometimes the smallest predator was the most dangerous, because it had the most to lose. "Chen!" she called softly, drawing a syringe from her bag with steady hands. "How many made it inside?" "2, maybe 3. His rifle cracked again, followed by the sound of splintering wood. "They're pushing hard!" Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in that sweet newborn scent that made every nerve in her body sing with protective fury. Then she placed the baby in the wooden crate Papa had built for storing hunting gear, lined with soft flannel, warm and secure. "Mama's got to work now, baby girl," she whispered. "But I promise you this, we're both walking out of here." She moved toward the bedroom door with the loaded syringe in one hand and a scalpel in the other. Her body screamed with the trauma of childbirth, but her mind had gone cold and calculating. She'd delivered babies in moving vehicles, in power outages, during medical emergencies that would paralyze most people. Crisis was her natural environment, and these men had made the fatal mistake of threatening her child. Through the doorway, she could see Chen pressed against the overturned kitchen table, trading shots with someone near the front window. A second figure moved through the shadows by the fireplace, trying to flank him. Neither had noticed the new mother approaching from their blind spot. Papa's voice whispered in her memory, "The mountain doesn't fight the storm, Sarah. It becomes part of the weather." Sarah McKenna stepped into the main room, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood what her father had tried to teach her. She wasn't just a woman defending her baby. She was the mountain itself, and these men had brought their storm to the wrong place. The real fight was about to begin. The gunman by the fireplace never saw her coming. Sarah moved through the shadows with predatory silence, her bare feet finding the quiet spaces between broken glass and splintered wood. The man was focused entirely on Chen's position, rifle raised, preparing to end the standoff with a flanking shot. Instead, he felt the bite of Sarah's scalpel across his wrist. Precise, surgical, severing tendons that sent his weapon clattering to the floor. Before he could cry out, the syringe found the soft spot behind his ear, and 20 milligrams of concentrated sedative sent him into unconsciousness so swift he collapsed without a sound. Chen spun at the movement, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Sarah crouched over the fallen gunman. Her medical instruments transformed into weapons of devastating efficiency. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "One down," Sarah whispered, already moving toward the second intruder's last known position. The pain from childbirth had become background noise, overwhelmed by the crystalline focus Papa had spent years teaching her on hunting trips she'd thought were just father-daughter bonding. Track your prey, know their habits, strike when they're vulnerable. The second gunman made the mistake of calling out to his partner. "Marco, you see the woman?" Sarah smiled grimly. Amateur. Papa would have skinned her alive for making such a tactical error during their hunting expeditions. She followed the voice through the cabin's chaos, moving with the patient, stalking rhythm her father had drilled into her since childhood. Chen provided cover fire, keeping the remaining attackers outside pinned behind their vehicles while Sarah worked. But she could hear more voices now, more engines arriving. Torino had brought an army to kill one pregnant woman, and even her newfound deadliness had limits. The second gunman rounded the corner just as Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside Papa's gun cabinet. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the bedroom where her daughter lay sleeping. The predatory calculation in his gaze made Sarah's vision go red. "He's thinking about my baby." The scalpel found his carotid artery with surgical precision, not deep enough to kill, but sufficient to send him into unconsciousness as his brain briefly starved for blood. He dropped beside his partner, and Sarah quickly zip-tied both men with supplies from her medical kit. "Sarah," Chen's voice carried new urgency. "More vehicles. They're surrounding us." She moved to the shattered front window, peering through Chen's fortifications at the nightmare assembling outside. 4 vehicles now, maybe 15 men, all armed and positioning themselves with military precision. Anthony Torino stood behind a black SUV, speaking into a radio with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle. The math was simple and terrifying. Even with her unexpected combat skills, even with Chen's experience, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The cabin would become a tomb for all 3 of them. But as Sarah watched the killers deploy around her home, another of Papa's lessons whispered through her memory. Not from hunting trips this time, but from the stories he'd told about surviving winters in these mountains when he was young. The mountain always wins, Sarah. Not because it fights harder, but because it changes the rules. "Chen," she said quietly, "how much ammunition do you have left?" "Maybe 2 magazines. You?" "Enough for what I'm planning." Sarah moved toward Papa's emergency supplies, pulling items that suddenly made perfect sense. Road flares, emergency fuel, and the radio Papa had maintained for weather emergencies. "But we're not going to outfight them." "Then what?" "We're going to outthink them." Sarah keyed the emergency frequency Papa had taught her years ago, the one monitored by Search and Rescue, Park Service, and most importantly, the federal task force that Chen had once belonged to. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Sarah McKenna at coordinates." She rattled off their location with practiced precision. "Federal agent under fire, multiple casualties. Request immediate assistance." The radio crackled to life almost instantly. "Sarah McKenna, this is Mountain Rescue. We show a federal alert at your coordinates. Assistance is inbound, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Sarah looked at their unconscious prisoners, at Chen's grim face, at the army assembling outside. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours, but Papa's voice steadied her. 20 minutes is enough time to change everything if you're smart about it. Chen, I need you to create a diversion. Draw them toward the front of the cabin. What are you planning?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since reading Papa's letter, she felt truly calm. "I'm going to introduce the Torino family to mountain justice." Outside, Anthony Torino's voice carried through the wind. "Time's up. We're coming in." Sarah checked on her daughter one last time, still sleeping peacefully in Papa's makeshift cradle, then returned to the main room with renewed purpose. The hunted had become the hunter, and these city killers had no idea what the mountain had in store for them. The moment of truth had arrived, and Sarah McKenna felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this precipice. 20 minutes until help arrived, her newborn daughter sleeping in Papa's wooden crate. 15 armed killers surrounding the cabin like wolves circling wounded prey. She could surrender, walk out with her hands raised, hope Torino's promise of a quick death was genuine rather than sadistic theater. Let the bloodline end here, as Papa's letter had warned it might. But looking at the unconscious gunmen zip-tied on her floor, men who'd invaded her sanctuary with murder in their hearts, Sarah realized surrender had never truly been an option. Not for her, not for Papa's granddaughter, not for the McKenna family. "Chen," she said, moving toward Papa's emergency supplies with decisive purpose. "Remember what I told you about becoming dangerous when our children are threatened?" "Yeah." I wasn't speaking metaphorically. Sarah pulled items from Papa's carefully organized storage, emergency road flares, camp fuel, climbing rope, and the avalanche beacon every serious mountaineer carried in winter. These men think they're hunting a helpless woman who just gave birth. They have no idea what Papa actually raised up here. Chen watched her work with growing understanding. What do you need me to do? Create chaos at the front. Make them think we're making a desperate last stand. I need them focused on the cabin's main approach. Sarah's hands moved with the same clinical precision she'd used during difficult births, steady, purposeful, utterly committed to the outcome. Can you hold them for 10 minutes? Against 15 men. You won't be fighting 15. Trust me. Chen studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod grimly. 10 minutes. Then what? Then Papa's little girl introduces the Torino family to 40 years of mountain survival expertise. Sarah activated the avalanche beacon, setting it to emergency broadcast, and they learn why you don't threaten a mother's child in her own territory. Outside, Torino's voice carried new impatience. Sarah, last chance to make this civilized. Civilized. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity. 30 years of hunting her family, murdering her father, terrorizing a pregnant woman, and he spoke of civilization. Chen, when I give the signal, light them up. Everything you've got. What's the signal? Sarah hefted the bundle of flares and fuel she'd assembled, her mind calculating distances and angles with the precision Papa had drilled into her during countless hunting expeditions. You'll know. She slipped toward the cabin's rear window, the one Papa had specifically positioned to overlook the steep ravine behind their property. City men, even experienced killers, always thought in terms of roads and clear approaches. They positioned themselves like urban predators, controlling obvious escape routes and lines of sight. But Papa had built this cabin using mountain logic. Every window, every door, every sightline had been chosen by a man who understood that the wilderness itself could become a weapon in skilled hands. Through the rear window, Sarah could see exactly what she'd expected. 2 men positioned to block escape toward the ravine, their attention split between watching the cabin and maintaining radio contact with Torino's assault team. They'd chosen their position based on preventing her flight, never considering that she might come to them. The first flare sailed through the darkness like a falling star, landing in the deep snow near the fuel depot where Torino's men had parked their vehicles. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the emergency fuel ignited with a whoosh that lit up the night, sending shadows dancing across the entire mountainside. Chen opened fire immediately, his rifle cracking in controlled bursts that shattered windows and sent Torino's men diving for cover. But Sarah was already moving, sliding through the rear window with predatory grace while every eye focused on the spectacular diversion. The 2 guards never saw her coming. The first felt the syringe behind his ear just as his partner went down to a precisely applied sleeper hold Papa had taught her for subduing injured animals. Both men collapsed into the snow without firing a shot, but Sarah wasn't finished, not even close. She keyed their radio with steady hands. Anthony Torino, this is Sarah McKenna. Static crackled before his voice responded, tight with rage. Where are you, bitch? Right where Papa trained me to be. In the mountains you don't understand, using skills you've never imagined, protecting my daughter with everything you people taught my family about survival. Sarah smiled into the darkness, feeling Papa's spirit flowing through her like mountain wind. Your advance team is down, your vehicles are burning, and help is coming whether you like it or not. The silence stretched long enough for Sarah to hear Torino conferring with his remaining men, their urban certainty cracking against mountain reality. You think you've won something? Torino finally snarled. We'll burn that cabin down around your baby's cradle. You can try, Sarah replied, already moving toward her next position with the fluid confidence of an apex predator. But you're not fighting just me anymore. The final confrontation was coming, and Sarah McKenna was ready to finish what her father had started 3 decades ago. The mountain held its breath as Sarah moved through the darkness like a force of nature unleashed. Behind her, the burning vehicles cast dancing shadows that transformed the familiar landscape into something primordial and dangerous. Torino's remaining men scrambled to reposition, their urban tactics crumbling against terrain they couldn't read, and an opponent they'd catastrophically underestimated. "All units sound off!" Torino's voice crackled through the captured radio, tight with the first notes of genuine fear. Sarah counted the responses. 9 men left, plus Torino himself. Still overwhelming odds, but no longer impossible. More importantly, she could hear the doubt creeping into their voices as they realized their carefully planned execution had become a nightmare of burning steel and vanishing sentries. Papa's voice whispered through her memory. "When the prey becomes the predator, the smart hunter retreats. The proud one dies." Anthony Torino had spent 30 years believing himself the apex predator in this blood feud. Tonight, he would discover his mistake. Sarah activated the second phase of her assault, using the avalanche beacon to trigger a pre-positioned cache Papa had established years ago, emergency supplies buried in weatherproof containers throughout their property. The explosion wasn't large, but it came from an impossible direction, deep in the forest where no one could have approached unseen. Or so Torino's men believed. "Contact northeast. She's flanking through the trees." "Negative. I have visual on the tree line. Nothing moving." "Then, where the hell?" The confusion in their voices told Sarah everything she needed to know. These killers understood urban warfare, assassination, the brutal mathematics of overwhelming force. But they'd never faced an opponent who could make the mountain itself fight alongside her. Chen's rifle spoke again from the cabin, drawing return fire that lit up the night with muzzle flashes. But Sarah wasn't moving toward the main battle anymore. She was hunting Torino himself, using every lesson Papa had taught her about tracking dangerous prey through hostile terrain. The avalanche beacon showed her exactly what she needed. Torino had positioned himself behind the largest vehicle, coordinating his men through radio contact while staying safely behind cover. A commander's position chosen by someone who'd survived decades of violence by never taking unnecessary risks. Tonight, his caution would become his weakness. Sarah approached from the ravine side, crawling through snow and shadow with infinite patience. Her body screamed protest from the recent childbirth, but she pushed the pain into a distant corner of her consciousness. Her daughter lay sleeping in that cabin, surrounded by men who would murder a newborn without hesitation. Every movement brought Sarah closer to ending that threat forever. Torino stood with his back to the ravine, speaking urgently into his radio while scanning the chaos he no longer controlled. At 60-something, he moved like a man who'd spent his life looking over his shoulder, but he'd made the fatal error of underestimating mountain terrain. "Marco, report," he snapped into the radio. "Stevens, where are you?" Silence answered him, the silence of men who would never speak again. Sarah rose from the darkness behind him like an avenging spirit, Papa's hunting knife gleaming in her hand. Not to kill, though she could have. Torino deserved death 1,000 times over for what he'd done to her family. But Sarah was still a healer at heart, and she needed him alive for what came next. The blade found the pressure point behind his ear with surgical precision, and Anthony Torino crumpled into the snow without firing a shot. "All units, this is your commander," Sarah spoke into his radio, perfectly mimicking his gravelly tone. "Pull back to checkpoint Alpha. We're regrouping for a dawn assault." The relief in the responding voices was audible. Torino's remaining men began withdrawing through the forest, grateful for any excuse to retreat from a battle that had turned inexplicably against them. Sarah zip-tied the unconscious crime boss with supplies from her medical kit, then activated Papa's emergency flare to signal Chen. The brilliant red light painted the mountainside in shades of victory and vindication. Minutes later, the distant thrum of helicopters announced the arrival of the federal task force Chen had contacted. Sarah dragged Torino's unconscious form toward the cabin, feeling Papa's presence stronger than ever. The letter sewn into his hunting coat had warned of this moment for 30 years. His training had prepared her to survive it. But as she looked up at the stars wheeling overhead, the same stars Papa had taught her to navigate by during their hunting expeditions, Sarah realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. The McKenna family had spent 3 decades running from the sins of the past. Tonight, Those sins had finally come home to face judgment, and Sarah had become the instrument of that justice, shaped by a father's love and forged by a mother's fury into something the Torino family had never encountered before. A predator who fought not for dominance or cruelty, but for the purest force in the natural world, the protection of innocent life. The mountain had spoken, and its voice was thunder. The helicopter's rotors beat against the mountain air like mechanical thunder, but Sarah McKenna barely heard them. She stood in the snow beside Anthony Torino's unconscious form, Papa's hunting knife still gleaming in her hand, and felt the weight of 30 years pressing down upon her shoulders. This should have been the end. The moment when justice finally caught up with the man who'd destroyed her family, when the federal task force swept down to arrest the surviving members of a crime syndicate that had terrorized witnesses for decades. But as the first helicopter touched down 50 yards away, Sarah saw something that made her blood turn to ice water. The tactical team that emerged moved with military precision, their weapons raised and ready, pointed not at Torino's scattered men, but directly at her. "Sarah McKenna!" The team leader's voice cut through the rotorwash. "Drop your weapon and step away from the prisoner." The terrible understanding crashed over her like an avalanche. Chen's task force contacts, the federal response, the perfectly timed rescue, none of it had been what it seemed. The corruption Papa had testified against 30 years ago hadn't been eliminated. It had simply evolved, grown deeper roots, spread into agencies that were supposed to protect witnesses like her family. Torino's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw the tactical team surrounding them, his cracked lips curved into a triumphant smile. "Did you really think," he wheezed, "that we'd hunt your family for 3 decades without insurance, without friends in very high places?" Sarah's grip tightened on the knife as more helicopters descended, disgorging teams of armed agents who moved to secure the perimeter. But their positioning told the real story. They weren't here to arrest Torino. They were here to clean up the mess he'd made, to eliminate the last witness who could expose the full scope of the conspiracy Papa had died trying to reveal. "Sarah," Chen's voice carried from the cabin, tight with betrayal and rage. The radio intercepts, they were listening all along. This whole thing was... The sniper's bullet cut him off mid-sentence, the crack echoing across the mountainside like breaking bone. Sarah saw Chen fall through the cabin's shattered window, and something fundamental broke inside her chest. Not fear, not desperation. Something far more dangerous. Pure, crystalline fury. "You killed him," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite the helicopter noise. "You killed the only honest man left in your whole rotten system." "Agent Chen served his purpose," the team leader replied with bureaucratic coldness. "He helped us locate the last members of the McKenna bloodline. Now drop the weapon and—" Sarah moved before he finished speaking, her body flowing into combat with the deadly grace Papa had beaten into her during countless hunting expeditions. But this wasn't hunting anymore. This was war. The knife left her hand with perfect accuracy, burying itself in the team leader's shoulder and spinning him into the snow. Sarah rolled behind Torino's body as automatic weapons fire erupted around her, using the crime boss as a human shield while her mind calculated angles and distances with predatory precision. Papa had prepared her for many things, but not this, the moment when the very system meant to protect her became the final enemy. When justice itself wore the mask of corruption and the only law left was the ancient one written in blood and survival. But perhaps that was exactly what she needed. Sarah dragged Torino deeper into the ravine as bullets sparked off rocks around them, her daughter's cries finally audible from the cabin where Chen had fallen. The sound cut through her like acid, reminding her of everything at stake. Not just her own life, not just Papa's legacy, but the innocent child who represented hope for a future free from this endless cycle of violence. "You can't run forever," Torino gasped as they tumbled down the rocky slope. "Even if you kill me, even if you escape tonight, they'll never stop hunting her. Your daughter will spend her whole life looking over her shoulder, just like you did." Sarah pressed her forearm against his throat, pinning him against a boulder, while tactical teams rappelled down the ravine walls above them. Then I'll make sure there's nothing left for them to hunt." The words came out with such cold finality that Torino's eyes widened in genuine fear, because he suddenly understood what Sarah had become in this moment of ultimate betrayal, not a victim fleeing for her life, but something far more terrifying, a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The final confrontation wasn't going to be about survival anymore. It was going to be about ending this blood feud permanently, no matter the cost. Sarah McKenna had tried to run, tried to hide, tried to trust in justice and law and civilization. Now she would try Papa's final lesson, the one he'd never wanted to teach her, but had prepared her for anyway. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent life was to become death itself. Sarah McKenna stared into Anthony Torino's eyes as the corrupt tactical teams closed in around them, and made a choice that would haunt her forever. "You want to end this bloodline?" she whispered, her voice carrying the finality of mountain avalanches. "Fine, let's end it together." She pulled the emergency beacon from her gear, not the avalanche locator she'd used earlier, but the one Papa had hidden in his deepest cache, the one marked with radiation symbols and federal warnings, sealed away for 30 years like the letter in his coat, the one he'd stolen from the crime scene before testifying, insurance against the day when even the government couldn't be trusted. Torino's eyes widened as he recognized the device. "You crazy bitch! That's evidence from the nuclear waste case. If that transmitter activates, every news agency in the country will learn exactly what your family was really trafficking in 1987, Sarah finished. Not just drugs, not just weapons. Radioactive material sold to the highest bidder. The real reason Papa had to disappear wasn't just murder, it was treason charges that would have brought down half of Washington. The tactical team leader's voice crackled through his radio as he rappelled closer. "Negative on civilian casualties. We need her alive until we locate the evidence cache." But Sarah was already moving, dragging Torino deeper into the ravine, while her thumb hovered over the beacon's activation switch. 30 years, Papa had kept this secret, protecting not just his family, but an entire government's worth of officials who'd looked the other way while radioactive waste disappeared into terrorist hands. "Your daughter," Torino gasped, clawing at the rocks as they slid toward the frozen creek below. "Think about your daughter. If you expose this, if that information goes public, the people involved will never let her live. There are bigger players than me, Sarah. International players who—" "I know." Sarah's voice was steady despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. "Papa told me in the letter. Every name, every connection, every dirty deal that kept him running for 30 years. She could hear her baby crying in the cabin above, could hear the tactical teams coordinating their assault on Chen's position. The honest agent was probably already dead, killed for the crime of believing the system could still work, just like Papa would have been killed eventually, no matter how well he hid. "Then you know what happens if you activate that beacon," Torino wheezed. "Your daughter becomes the most hunted child in the world. Every intelligence agency, every terrorist cell, every government with nuclear ambitions, they all want her bloodline eliminated." Sarah looked up at the stars Papa had taught her to navigate by, the same constellations that had guided mountain families for generations. Maybe she grows up in a world where the truth finally came out, where the people responsible for 30 years of murder and cover-ups finally faced consequences. The beacon felt warm in her frozen hands, its weight somehow lighter than Papa's hunting knife had been. This was the sacrifice the mountain demanded, not just her life, not just her freedom, but the certainty of her daughter's safety, the choice between living as eternal prey and dying to break the cycle forever. "There's a third option," she whispered, and Torino's desperate expression shifted to confusion. Sarah pressed the beacon's activation switch. But instead of the broad-spectrum emergency broadcast he'd expected, the device emitted a single, narrow-band transmission. A coded signal Papa had programmed decades ago, designed to reach one specific recipient who'd been waiting 30 years for this moment. The real federal agent Papa had trusted, the one who'd helped him disappear, the one who'd been building an airtight case against the entire conspiracy, waiting for the evidence that would make prosecution inevitable. "You see, Anthony," Sarah said, as helicopters appeared on the horizon. Different helicopters arriving from a different direction with different intentions. "Papa didn't just teach me how to hunt and survive, he taught me how to think like prey that's tired of running." Torino's face went ashen as he recognized the new aircraft. "That's impossible! Agent Morrison died in a carefully staged car accident, just like Papa's snowmobile crash. Except Morrison was smart enough to die publicly while staying alive privately." Sarah smiled with fierce satisfaction as the legitimate federal response team rappelled down to secure them. Turns out honest agents are better at playing dead than crime bosses are at confirming kills. The corrupt tactical teams above suddenly found themselves surrounded, their radio communications jammed, their extraction routes cut off by agents who'd spent 3 decades preparing for this moment. But Sarah's victory came with a price that cut deeper than any physical wound. Her daughter would grow up without the peaceful anonymity she'd dreamed of. There would be trials, testimony, years of protection details and security briefings. The quiet mountain life Papa had died trying to preserve was gone forever. As Agent Morrison himself emerged from the helicopter, grey-haired, weathered, but very much alive, Sarah McKenna held her crying baby and understood the true cost of justice. Sometimes winning meant sacrificing the very thing you'd fought to protect. The resolution. Agent Morrison approached through the swirling snow like a ghost returning from the dead, his weathered face bearing the weight of 30 years spent building an unbreakable case. Sarah clutched her daughter closer, watching the man Papa had trusted enough to die for move with the careful precision of someone who'd survived by never making careless moves. "Sarah McKenna," Morrison said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of decades in federal service. "Your father spoke of you often during our final meetings. He said you had his eyes for seeing through lies." Around them, the legitimate federal agents moved with swift efficiency, disarming and zip-tying the corrupt tactical team members who'd been moments away from eliminating the last witness to their crimes. The radio chatter was all business now. Coordinates, evidence tags, medical evac protocols for Chen, who was somehow still breathing despite the sniper's bullet. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from Morrison's expression. "The immediate threat, yes. Torino's organization, the corrupt elements we've been tracking, tonight's operation will put them away permanently." Morrison knelt beside the unconscious crime boss, his expression mixing satisfaction with something darker. "But you know that's not what you're really asking." Sarah nodded, feeling Papa's presence in the mountain wind that stirred around them. Her daughter had quieted in her arms, dark eyes blinking up at the star-filled sky with the fearless curiosity of the very young. "She'll never be safe, will she?" "Not completely. Safety is an illusion, especially for families like yours." Morrison's honesty cut like a blade. "But anonymity, that's different. We can give her a new identity, relocate you both somewhere the reach of these organizations can't extend. Your father's evidence cache has given us enough leverage to guarantee that level of protection." The helicopter's rotors began winding down as more agents secured the perimeter, but Sarah barely heard them. She was thinking about Papa's letter, about the life he'd sacrificed to give her choices he'd never had, about Chen fighting for justice even when the system turned against him, about her daughter, who would grow up knowing her grandfather only through stories and faded photographs. Agent Chen, will he survive? The medics think so. Shoulder wound, lots of blood, but he's conscious and asking about you. Morrison's expression softened slightly. He's a good man. There aren't many left in the Bureau who would have made the choices he made tonight. Sarah looked down at her daughter, whose tiny fingers had wrapped around the hunting knife Papa had left her. Even now, even in the aftermath of violence, the child seemed drawn to the tools of survival their family had always carried. What happens during the trials? How long will we have to testify? Years, probably. Torino's organization has connections spanning decades, reaching into agencies and governments we're still identifying. Your father's evidence cache is comprehensive, but building prosecutable cases against targets this embedded in the system, it takes time. The weight of that reality settled over Sarah like the mountain cold. Years of protection details and safe houses, of looking over her shoulder every time they ventured into public. Years of her daughter growing up surrounded by federal marshals instead of friends, learning to fear strangers instead of trusting the world Papa had wanted to give her. There is another option, Morrison said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. We could bury your father's evidence deeper, arrange for Torino to have an accident in federal custody. The corruption would continue, but you and your daughter could disappear completely. New identities, new lives, no trials or testimony required. Sarah felt Papa's hunting knife warm in her hand, remembering the lessons he'd taught her about choices that couldn't be undone, about the difference between surviving and living, between safety and justice, about the responsibility that came with truth too dangerous for silence. Papa spent 30 years running from the consequences of doing the right thing, she said finally. He died believing that someday someone would finish what he started. Morrison nodded slowly. And you're willing to be that someone, even knowing what it will cost your daughter? Sarah looked up at the stars Papa had taught her to navigate by, feeling their ancient light on her face like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Chen calling her name, could hear the organized chaos of a federal investigation that would reshape how the government dealt with organized crime. Her daughter would grow up in a world where justice had a price, but also where truth could survive the people who tried to bury it, where a mountain midwife's testimony could topple crime syndicates that had operated with impunity for decades. Papa always said the mountain teaches you what matters most, Sarah said, kissing her daughter's forehead as the first light of dawn touched the peaks around them. I think I finally understand what he meant. Some legacies were worth the cost of claiming them. The return. 6 months later, Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of her new home, a modest ranch house in a Montana valley where the mountains rolled gentler than the Colorado peaks she'd left behind. Her daughter Emma gurgled happily in her carrier, reaching for dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows. Sarah no longer had to check for sniper sights. The federal protection detail had been lifted 2 weeks ago, after the last of Torino's associates accepted plea deals rather than face trials where Papa's evidence would be presented in excruciating detail. Morrison had kept his word. The prosecutions had been swift, comprehensive, and final. The corruption that had murdered her father was finally cauterized from the system. But Sarah knew she would never again be the woman who'd lived peacefully in Papa's cabin, delivering babies and trusting that isolation meant safety. Mrs. Chen? A voice called from the driveway, using the surname she'd chosen when the Witness Protection Program offered her a new identity. She'd kept Sarah. Some things were too fundamental to change, but taken the name of the federal agent who'd nearly died protecting her truth. Agent Morrison emerged from an unmarked sedan, moving with the careful gait of someone still recovering from the stress of the most complex prosecution in bureau history. Behind him walked a figure that made Sarah's breath catch, David Chen himself, his left arm still in a sling from the sniper's bullet, his face bearing new lines that spoke of months spent testifying against colleagues who'd betrayed everything they'd sworn to protect. Agent Chen. Sarah's voice carried warmth that surprised her. Morrison said you were being transferred to the Financial Crimes Division. Something about investigating banks being safer than chasing crime families. Chen's laugh held rueful acknowledgement. Turns out getting shot by corrupt federal agents earns you a desk job whether you want one or not. His expression grew serious as he studied her face. You look different, peaceful. Sarah considered that assessment while Emma babbled contentedly in her arms. Peace wasn't quite right. She still woke some nights reaching for Papa's hunting knife, still scanned crowds with predatory awareness that would never fully fade. But the constant tension of being prey had lifted, replaced by something more complex. "I feel like myself again," she said finally. "Not running from Papa's choices, not hiding from his legacy, just living with the consequences of my own decisions." Morrison nodded approvingly. "The last testimony session wrapped up yesterday. Torino pled guilty to racketeering charges rather than face trial for your father's murder. He'll die in federal prison." The news should have brought satisfaction, but Sarah felt only a quiet settling, like snow finally coming to rest after an avalanche. Justice wasn't the dramatic closure she'd expected, just the slow, grinding work of holding people accountable for decades of choices. What about the others? The officials who looked the other way? 14 convictions so far, with more pending. Your father's evidence cache was even more comprehensive than we'd hoped. Chen's voice carried professional pride mixed with personal cost. "It's the largest corruption case in bureau history." Emma chose that moment to grab Sarah's hair, tugging with the determined strength of a 6-month-old discovering cause and effect. The gesture was so perfectly normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Sarah felt tears threaten. This was what Papa had died for, not the dramatic vindication of justice, but the simple possibility of his granddaughter growing up unafraid. "She has his eyes," Morrison observed, studying Emma with the gentle attention of a man who'd spent 30 years wondering if this moment would ever come. "And his stubbornness," Sarah replied, gently untangling tiny fingers from her hair. "Yesterday she figured out how to escape her crib. I found her on the floor, perfectly content, like she'd planned the whole thing." Chen laughed. "Sounds like she inherited more than just his eyes." They stood in comfortable silence, 3 people bound by violence but choosing to find meaning in survival. Sarah realized this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of people who understood their necessity. "I've been thinking about Papa's cabin," she said eventually. "The federal seizure order was lifted last week. I could go back, raise Emma where he raised me." Morrison and Chen exchanged glances that held decades of law enforcement experience. "Is that what you want?" Morrison asked carefully. Sarah looked out at the Montana mountains, gentler than Colorado's peaks, but no less beautiful. She thought about Papa's lessons, about survival and justice, about the difference between hiding and healing, about the responsibility that came with truth too dangerous for silence. "No," she said, and the word carried surprising certainty. "Papa spent his whole life looking backward, protecting me from his past. I want Emma to grow up looking forward." She was Sarah McKenna Chen now, midwife, witness, survivor, mother, changed by violence but not defined by it. Home wasn't a place Papa had hidden from the world, but wherever she chose to build a life worth his sacrifice. Some returns weren't about going back at all. The new beginning. 2 years had passed since that snowy night when Sarah's world fractured and reformed, and now she stood in the kitchen of her Montana home, watching 18-month-old Emma toddle across the hardwood floor with the fearless determination of someone who'd never known a world where shadows held threats. Sunlight streamed through windows that no longer required security film, illuminating a life built on the foundation of Papa's sacrifice but shaped by Sarah's own choices. The midwifery practice she'd established in town had grown beyond her expectations. Mountain communities, it turned out, needed healers who understood both the isolation and the fierce independence that defined rural life. Women drove hours through winding passes to have Sarah attend their births, drawn not just by her skills but by something deeper, a recognition of someone who'd survived the kind of darkness that made ordinary dangers seem manageable. Emma babbled happily as she explored the living room, her chubby hands leaving prints on the coffee table where Sarah's latest medical journals lay scattered. The child moved with Papa's purposeful curiosity, examining everything with intense focus before moving on to the next discovery. Last week, she'd figured out how to open the safety latches on the kitchen cabinets. This morning, Sarah had found her sitting contentedly among the pots and pans, arranging them in some pattern only she understood. "She's getting into everything now," Sarah said into her phone, where Chen's voice carried the warmth of someone who'd become family despite the circumstances that brought them together. "Yesterday I caught her trying to climb the bookshelf. I think she was going for Papa's hunting manual on the top shelf." Chen's laugh came through clear and strong. His voice had lost the careful tension it had carried during those first months after the shooting, when every conversation felt weighted with the gravity of what they'd survived. Natural-born climber. Morrison would say she's conducting reconnaissance. The mention of Morrison brought its familiar pang of loss mixed with gratitude. The veteran agent had passed away peacefully 6 months ago, his decades-long mission finally complete. At his funeral, Sarah had met other agents he'd protected over the years, witnesses who'd become teachers, accountants, shop owners, all living quiet lives made possible by one man's commitment to justice. She'd realized then that Emma would grow up as part of an invisible community of survivors, connected by shared understanding of what it meant to live beyond violence. "Any word on the last of the appeals?" Sarah asked, shifting the phone to her shoulder as she followed Emma's determined path toward the kitchen. "Rejected yesterday. Torino's lawyer tried one final challenge, but the evidence was too solid. Papa's cash closed every loophole they could have exploited." Chen's voice carried professional satisfaction, but something else too, a recognition that justice, while necessary, couldn't undo the cost of obtaining it. "It's really over, Sarah. The legal system has processed every piece of evidence, convicted every corrupt official we could identify. The organization that killed your father no longer exists." Sarah paused in the kitchen doorway, watching Emma discover the fascinating properties of magnets on the refrigerator. The child's concentration was absolute as she worked to understand cause and effect, her dark eyes, Papa's eyes, bright with the joy of learning. This was what the end of a 30-year nightmare looked like, a toddler playing with alphabet magnets while her mother planned the afternoon's patient visits. "Chen," Sarah said quietly, using his first name now instead of his title, "do you ever wonder what Papa would think of all this? Of Emma growing up normal, of me practicing midwifery instead of hiding in the mountains?" The pause before his answer told her he'd considered this question many times. "I think he'd be amazed that normal was possible. He spent so many years believing the only choice was between hiding and dying. You proved there was a third option, living openly and making the world account for its failures." Through the window, Sarah could see the Montana peaks rising against an endless sky, their snow-covered summits catching the afternoon light. They were different from Colorado's jagged Rockies, rounder, more forgiving, but no less majestic. She'd learned that healing didn't require returning to the place where you'd been wounded. Sometimes it meant finding new ground entirely. Emma squealed with delight as she managed to stick 2 magnets together, then immediately began the process of pulling them apart to see if the magic would work again. Her granddaughter would grow up believing in a world where persistence led to understanding, where problems had solutions that could be discovered through patient investigation. "I should go," Sarah said, as Emma began her determined crawl toward the stairs. "Someone's decided the second floor needs exploring." "Give her a kiss from Uncle Chen," he said, and Sarah smiled at how naturally the title had evolved. Emma would grow up with an extended family of federal agents, prosecutors, and other survivors, people who understood that the most important victories were measured not in headlines, but in children who slept peacefully through the night. Sarah scooped up Emma, who protested briefly before settling contentedly against her mother's shoulder. Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of pine and possibility of a future built on truth instead of secrets. This was Papa's true legacy, not the violence that had shaped his life, but the granddaughter who would never know the weight of inherited fear. Some battles ended not with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet triumph of ordinary days filled with extraordinary peace.